welcome to this episode of Earth Talks. The UN Conference on Climate Change, COP26, was scheduled to be held this year. It's now been moved to 2021 with the UK as the host country. It's being billed as the most important climate talk since countries signed on the Paris Agreement in 2015. To discuss what to expect from COP26 in a post-pandemic world, I'm delighted to introduce my panel today, Nick Bridge, the Foreign Secretary, Special Representative on Climate Change. He has served on several diplomatic postings to China, Japan, and the US. Thomas Spencer, who is an associate researcher with TERI. He's co-authored several influential publications related to the Paris Agreement. He also coordinates TERI's flagship program on decarbonization of the Indian power sector. Nick, if I can start with you first, how is COP26 going to be? How is it going to be ambitious given the pressures of the pandemic on world economies, especially the developing world?
Thank you, Bahar. Thanks for having me. Yes, COP26 has to be ambitious and it has to succeed. This is the big moment. I mean, it was going to be 5 years on from the Paris Agreement, which, as you know, was the moment when all the countries came together in Paris and said, this is real, it's incredibly urgent, and we're all going to do what we need to do. But the commitments that were actually made at Paris were significantly insufficient to tackle climate change. And so this is the 5 years on. We all agreed we would come back together and ramp up our ambition, significantly enhance our ambition. It has to be now a year after because of COVID. But actually, I think we have no choice but to see this as an opportunity. You know, we would have had COP already if it had been on track. And can I say that we would have had enough of a quantum of ambition? It would have been tough, I think, to achieve. And actually, with the extra time we have, we just have to use that time. So the goal now is to basically, between now and this time next year, is to get into the position where every country can come forward and say that it's doing more. And also it's doing more to tackle climate change because it's good for their own society, good for their own economy, good for their own air quality, good for their own jobs, good for their own industries. And so let's have a clean, green recovery out of COVID that can then deliver on COP.
Right. So what kind of commitments are you expecting from countries, and how challenging is it to expect countries to come forward given the, all the pressures of the pandemic right now?
It is challenging, but the Paris Agreement helps us because it's given us a framework. It tells us that we need to do at least three things. One is we have to all commit to this long-term strategy. And we have a lot of countries now, including China, Japan, Korea, who have committed now to a net zero date before 2060 in China, by 2050 in Japan and Korea. In the UK and many other countries, we've already legislated for that long-term net zero where we no longer contribute to climate change. The second thing, so we want as many countries, got over 100 now making those commitments, but we haven't seen the plans that actually show it's going to happen. The second thing is to get as many countries to enhance significantly their 2030. It's called the NDC, the nationally determined contribution of every country. And so by 2030, really in the decade, we have to see this quantum of shift in emissions reductions. We have to do this early, and we can't wait another few years to show the trajectory turning. The third thing, and equally, if not more important, is just support all the countries to adapt and be more resilient and to finance this transition. Yeah. And so our commitments financially from donor countries, but also to shift the financial sector privately into the right kind of investments. So we want to see those three things: a long-term goal, a near-term goal, and then the financing and the technical and the policy support to all countries.
All right. Now, if I may ask you, you had recently said we need to recognize that climate change is the result of an economic system. Solving it involves shifting the whole economic system. Now, how do we shift the entire economic system? And the announcements by Boris Johnson, for instance, to phase out petrol and diesel cars. He's advanced the date from 2040 to 2030. Would you say that's part of this shift?
Yes, I mean, we know what we need to do to make this change. And in the areas where we're creating emissions, in energy systems, in transport, how we move around, and in how we use land to grow our food, sustain our forests, look after our nature. These are the big sectors where we're causing emissions, and we need to be better as stewards. And we know how to do the cleaner energy, the cleaner transport, and the cleaner use of our natural resources. And India is leading, obviously, in the renewable energy sector with a phenomenal 4 times more wind and solar in the last decade. The commitment on the railways, I think, is very exciting. So we know how to make these changes. And as I said at the beginning, the idea is that firstly, that energy, to take energy for an example, that energy now in the clean sector is cheaper.
Yes.
It's cheaper in the UK, it's cheaper in India. It's also got all these additional benefits we're not even measuring around the quality of our air for our children to breathe. And in that kind of lifestyle, more, in the UK, we have still too much driving around, in short journeys and not getting health and walking and cycling. So there's very real ways in which we have to shift the way that the economy functions, but it's a good shift, and it's a shift that benefits our society and our economy.
It's a good shift. Now, I think this is a good point to get Thomas Spencer into the conversation. Thomas, you had said recently on Twitter, I came across several tweets from you where you said, for the first time, we're no longer negotiating either the legal framework nor the ambition. We have the Paris Agreement, we have the targets. So what new ground do you expect COP26 to achieve?
Thanks very much, Bahar, also for having me on the show. Very happy to be here. So I'd just like to explain my statement a little bit because it may seem a little strange. For the last 25 years, we have been negotiating on climate change under the auspices of the UN. And those negotiations were essentially occupied with 2 questions. The first question was, what should the legal framework be for the agreement? We tried the Kyoto Protocol, which was a legal treaty that applied only to developed countries. We tried a more flexible framework in Copenhagen. And then finally, in the Paris Agreement, we came up with the answer to that question, which is a legal treaty that countries have ratified, but that embodies a lot of flexibility and a lot of dynamism.
Yes.
And the other question that we tried to answer was around ambition. Should we limit warming to 2 degrees? Should all countries contribute, and so on? And we essentially answered that question also in the Paris Agreement. We have to limit warming to 2 degrees, and we have to make best efforts to stay even below 1.5 degrees. But more importantly, the national conversations about ambition have moved forward significantly since Paris. So as Nick highlighted, you have countries like South Korea, China, Japan, European Union, United Kingdom, and now under the Biden administration, also the United States, essentially pledging to reach net zero by the middle of the century. So the ambition is there. I think the key question for COP26 is, can we transfer that ambition into implementation? Can we, for example, start to look at the governance regimes for trade, for finance, for technology innovation, and think about how to shape them in ways that facilitate the achievement of countries' ambitions? And the other thing, as Nick mentioned, that we need to see in COP26 is these long-term detailed strategies from countries to reach net zero by the middle of the century. And those need to be backed up by credible short-term commitments as part of that pathway. So for example, if China says that we're going to reach net zero by 2060, but continues to invest in coal-fired power plants and steel production and so on, then there's a real question about credibility. So for me, for COP26, the 2 key questions are implementation and credibility. We have to make good on our commitments.
Right. Implementation and credibility, those are good points. But I have to ask you, you're in Mumbai right now, you work on Indian policy. So we had Prime Minister Modi announce the first auction to private companies to mine and sell coal. And many are seeing this as a regressive move in a country where renewable energy has become cheaper than fossil fuels. What would you say? Your thoughts?
I think it's a great question, and I'm very happy to answer it because it's also a difficult question. So first of all, we have to understand that India is still a poor country. Its energy demand will continue to grow. And I think even in a really ambitious climate change scenario, coal in certain sectors would continue to grow. We expect that coal can peak in the power generation sector within the next 10 years. But for certain industrial sectors, it's a little bit more difficult to get so quickly off coal. So India's coal demand will grow, but probably nowhere near as fast as it has in the past. The other thing is India imports a lot of coal. And so, the objective of reducing its imports through more domestic production is legitimate. The other thing that I would say is, if you look at the responses to this auction, they're not exactly a ringing endorsement, right? You had a 50% response rate. You had a significant number of responses that came from companies that are not actually active at all in the mining or in the manufacturing or in the power generation sector. So how credible those responses are is an open question. And you had a number of responses that received a single bidder and therefore, have to be retendered.
Yeah.
So I think the overall picture that emerges when you look at India's domestic ambition is that India is certainly doing a lot to transform, for example, power generation, industrial energy efficiency. But there is more that India can do. There's no question about that. And hopefully in the next year, as we move towards COP26, some more of that potential for action can become concrete in new undertakings by India.
Yeah. And Nick, if I can just come back to you, you spoke about one of the expectations from COP26 on finance. So where are we on finance? Do we have any commitments? Are we making any progress? And I have to keep reminding that, a post-pandemic world is going to put huge pressures on countries. So how do you circumvent that? How do you get countries to say, put more money on the table?
I think there's two aspects to finance I might highlight, at least. One is the critical commitment of governments to deliver public climate finance support to the poorest and most vulnerable countries. That's absolutely essential and a long-standing part of the negotiation. As Thomas mentioned, is we've agreed what we need to do on that, and now we need to be credible and deliver on it. It's a tough fiscal environment for sure, but we are still seeing increases in those climate finance commitments, and we need to deliver on that. We also need to deliver on what our commitments look like in the 2020s, begin to look at what that framework is and how we ensure that continuing flow. And the other part of it, which is not a but an and, is that meanwhile, while we're talking about 100 billion of public finance, there is $240 trillion of global financial assets out there. And it's incredibly important that we also focus on how the public finance leverages, encourages, reassures the financial sector overall that this direction of travel is necessary, that the investment opportunities, the infrastructure opportunities, and so on, have to all now go into the sustainable sector and into the right kind of investments. Within the decade, pretty much all that financial sector money has to be going into the right places,
yes,
and not the wrong places. There's just not any more carbon budget to get this wrong. And so I think these two issues, the public finance commitment and the overall financial sector, have to operate together in a mutually reinforcing way. And one of the ways, for example, that we have been pioneering is the complicated sounding Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which is our former Governor Mark Carney's initiative with other colleagues in the G20, where we all show that we have to have every financial asset class and every part of the business sector understanding its climate risk, understanding the embedded carbon in all of its supply chains, and disclosing what it's doing, and then taking responsibility for that risk. And once investors can see which businesses are really taking this seriously and are sustainable and credible in the long term, then that will shift money. And we talked about coal. The fact is now that I'm not seeing many banks backing coal, because this is a 30-40 year investment and there's just no economic rationale for doing it. There are social reasons, there are political reasons that we have to do this shift out of coal very carefully, but we also have to do it. And the money talks. The money is going into the renewable sector, not into the fossil fuel sector as much.
Excellent. My final question to you, the world has changed since Paris, not just in terms of the pandemic, but also things have changed in the US in terms of leadership. So what can a Biden presidency mean for the upcoming COP?
Well, it's very, very good news to have all those early commitments from the president. I mean, in his campaign, but the president-elect has already made his appointment of John Kerry.
Yeah.
He's committed on day one to rejoin the Paris Agreement. And I was listening to one of his podcasts. You know, he did a podcast for another YouTube available channel called Pod Save America. And he talked for 20 minutes. He talked for 20 or 30 minutes with real passion and real knowledge and commitment about the array of ways in which he wants to engage on this. He wants to rebuild American investment along a clean track. We'll have to see how the congressional leadership takes that, but there's lots that you can do on that. But he also wants to clearly show that America is back internationally and taking a leadership role with other countries. And I'm sure he's looking to partner with such a vital country as India in the years ahead. The UK is in the same place. I mean, we've got this wonderful collaboration with you on the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, for example. We've got huge investments with you in green growth equity funds, a huge array of research and development collaborations. Thomas, knows a lot about everything we're doing across the space. And I know that the US will also want to deepen and thicken the relationships it's already got with India. And so we can all be genuine partners on this. I mean, the COVID situation has been terrible and continues to be terrible. But I think if there is a silver lining, we've seen that it's given us time to reflect on the need to do things differently. And it's given us a bit of time to start to see what, to be honest, was a rather difficult political picture globally, but to take a very encouraging economic picture and take the time to work the politics through. So right now, my colleagues in the UK are partaking in 70 climate dialogues in the next week or two with UN partners to start to unpack the negotiations and the challenges, very difficult questions that we face, to give everybody trust and confidence that we can do this. So we're just going to do everything we can. We look to India to be our partner in all of this, to be ambitious with its NDC, to continue to champion the great work it's doing in areas like renewable energy, and so that we can move forward and in a resilient and climate-proof way.
What I'm struck by is how optimistic both you gentlemen sound. Let's hope that this spirit remains all the way to COP26. All the very best for the preparations, Nick. All the very best, Thomas, with your work on decarbonizing of the Indian power sector. I know that's going to be a huge challenge, but I believe that India is committed to it, and slowly but steadily we'll all reach there. Hopefully. So thank you so much, gentlemen, for speaking to us on Earth Talks.
Thanks for all of your work. Yeah, thanks for your work too. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Bahar.
Thank you. Thank you.